Howdy folks. Today we are going to take a look at Mongoose. So what is Mongoose, you might be asking? Well, Mongoose is to MongoDB as Sequelize is to SQL. So where Sequelize is a helpful library that can help us manage our schema, it'll do queries on our behalf, things like that. Mongoose is similar for MongoDB. The syntax can be a little complicated, but it does help enforce a schema, and it does help kind of some actions that you might want to take, especially with subdocuments. It makes them a little bit easier. Now, why would you want a schema? Isn't the whole point of MongoDB that is schemaless? Well, one of the issues with MongoDB is that the lack of an enforced schema means that you actually have to enforce that in your code. So you have to write code to verify that fields exist and things like that. Mongoose can help take care of that for you. So Mongoose can actually add in a schema that's in your code. So it's not that hard to change. If you need to change it, you just change the schema in your code like you would have to do normally, and Mongoose just starts enforcing it. It doesn't actually make any changes on the Mongo server because that's just how they're set up. So the first thing we got to look at is how do we connect to it? Well, there's a specific module we need. So we have MongoDB, right? So let's go ahead and run install Mongoose. Mongoose does come with its own copy of MongoDB. So if you don't have MongoDB, that's fine. We have Mongoose 692. That should be totally fine. Now, to make the connection, Mongoose also uses a connection string. Right? So require. I'm actually going to keep this connect Mongo in here simply because I want to actually have both running at the same time because I want to slowly transition this project over from MongoDB to Mongoose. So now we have Mongoose. Let's take a look at our connection. We're going to say, okay, mongoose.connect. Okay, and then we're going to pass in our connection string. Oops. And then we're going to pass in some options. And there's a couple standard options that you want to have for this. They are use new URL parser and use unified typology. These are both things that recent versions of Mongo have introduced, and they're just good. They haven't defaulted them to on to avoid breaking backwards compatibility. New URL parser, there used to be an older way of parsing the connection string. We want to use the new way. Unified typology, there are several different kinds of Mongo servers that you can run into, and the Mongoose project used to handle them all differently. With unified topology, it treats them all the same. Then we're going to export, okay, Mongoose. Well, let's see. Let's just export as db. Mongoose.connection. Okay. So normally we do connect Mongo, get db. I'm actually just going to export. Let's do this. Mongoose DB. Normally you just export mongoose.connection, and that should be fine. All right. So now take a look at our server. We already have this connect Mongo. I'm going to put another one in here. So I'm going to import Mongoose DB, and Mongoose DB actually has an event-driven architecture. So with the previous one, we had this connect Mongo, right, which has this callback, and it calls the callback once the client exists, once the connection string has happened. Oh, we have the same thing in here. So these options must just be passed straight through from Mongoose to Mongo, since those are there. So what I'm going to do, I still want this connect Mongo because I want the old database connection to be there. But I can say mongosedb dot once open callback function. And inside that callback function after that, then I'm going to listen on the app. So why do we do that? Why do we do this once? Well, once is a way of doing an event listener that only happens one time. So you could say, okay, I don't want this event to fire except the first time. So this just says, okay, once this is open, you can get rid of that event listener. We started the app. Everything is good. All right, let's give it a shot and see what happens. So we're going to run npm start. All right, we get a warning. The strict query option, we switch back to false. That's not a big deal. You can just ignore that, or you can use Mongoose set if you want. But you notice the whole system just kind of hangs, right? That's kind of annoying. And the reason for that is it doesn't like that we're doing a connection and another connection. Mongo is not super happy with that. So if we run here, you can see now the server starts. So it looks like we're not going to be able to make these both live in harmony, which is unfortunate, but that's okay. So I'm just going to get rid of this database thing here, and then we're just going to module exports just the connection, which is okay. And we'll get rid of the MongoDB here. And actually, we could probably get rid of the MongoDB here as well, because Mongoose already has its own copy. Okay, so now we're just going to pull in, we'll just call this DB then. And we'll just say db.once. Okay. Start that. Server starts. Totally fine. None of these things are going to work because all of our routes require the MongoDB connection rather than Mongoose, but that's okay. So let's take a look at the models. So similar to Sequelize, Mongoose has models, and that contains the schema. So from here, we're going to create a models folder, and then let's see, what is our main model that we use here? Let's take a look. We're going to use, let's see, users, right? So we've got this collection users, right? So a model in Mongoose is going to represent that collection. So Mongoose, fire Mongoose. Okay, so we'll pull this in. Now when you want a schema, okay, so we're going to call this the user schema equals new mongoose.schema. And this is basically the data that we have about this user. What do we have in here? Well, let's actually bring up Compass, and let's take a look at what our data actually looks like. All right, so if I go into Compass, it looks like my users DB has actually disappeared, which is kind of unfortunate, but I imagine that's just because I probably deleted it at some point. Okay, well then we'll just go from scratch. So we've got our user schema here, and for the schema, we're going to have the field name and then the type. Now in Sequelize and SQL, we had specific types. We have varchars, text, boolean, integers, stuff like that. In Mongoose, the types are just regular JavaScript types. So let's say if we have, and Mongoose creates the ID by default, so we don't need to worry about that. Username. So this is going to be a string. Password is also a string. Okay, and then let's say email string. Let's just go with that for now. Okay, so we've got that schema. That's totally fine, all set up. And now what we need is we need to create a model, a Mongoose model. So the schema and the model are different things, whereas in Sequelize they were kind of the same thing. You created a Sequelize class or an instance, and then you added the schema to it. Here we've got our schema, and then we're going to create a model. The reason for this is because when we're dealing with subdocuments, having the schema set up this way is useful. So now we're going to create a model. So we're going to say user, or users equals mongoose.model. We'll give it the name, okay, users, and this is going to be the name of the collection, and then we give it the schema. All right, and then we export it. Equals users. We're just going to export the model. That gets set up. That's all good. And now I'm going to come over here and I'm going to import that in here. User require models users. Actually, this should be users. All right. So now let's restart our server and let's just make sure that loads okay. All right, seems like it started up all right. So the first thing we want to do then is we want to create a new item. Okay, so we've got our body, that's still in there. We're not going to do get DB anymore, so we're going to get rid of that. What we are going to do is similar to Sequelize, we have our model now. So I'm going to say users dot create. Okay. The first parameter, just like in Mongo, is going to be the actual creation string. So we pop that in there. And then the second parameter is going to be a very similar thing to here. Error and result. Not 100% sure the result actually shows up in there, but let's check. So you can see this is very similar to Mongoose or Mongo, except it's just handling the going through the model and the schema. All right, so let's start that up. All right, and then let's get Postman up so we can actually test that route. All right, so let's go into Postman. The API user post, these are all fine, should be good. Let's run this. Let's see what happens. All right, and now you can see a difference here. Okay, with Mongo, we actually just got the ID and an acknowledged flag, whereas in Mongoose, it actually gives us the entire thing, the entire object. As you can see, the ID, username, password, email, which is kind of nice. And then you get this V flag, which you might be wondering, what is this V? Well, that's the version. Mongoose is actually using that to internally track what version of the schema we're using. So as you update the Mongoose schema, you can actually increment a version on it, and that will let Mongoose know when objects have gotten out of date, which can be kind of useful, but is also complicated. So if we go back here, UserDB, our users collection, now we can see all that stuff is in there. So great, that's how we do creation. It's actually very similar. Now you notice something too. We actually put a lot of other fields in here. 2 other fields, books and vehicle. Those didn't make it in here. And the reason is because Mongoose checks against the schema. It will not add or update fields that do not match the schema. It didn't give us an error. It just ignored them. And so that's just something to bear in mind. Mongoose, if I wanted books, I could just actually put in books as in an array and just let it know, hey, there's some stuff. But for now, I'm just going to get rid of that. All right, so let's look at get. First thing we're going to do is get by ID. This is very similar. We have our ID here, and we're pointing out parameters. We're not going to have the get DB. What we are going to do is we're going to instead say users.findOne. findOne, right? Very similar. In fact, it's the same search. Okay. And it's actually the same callback as well. Oops. Pop that in there. Yeah, same callback. Except in this case, it's actually just finding one on the users. So we don't need, so we normally have that db.collection. In here, Mongoose knows what the collection is. All right, so let's restart that. Let's grab our ID from here, and we'll go into get user, put the ID in here, run that, and there we go. We get our document back. Similarly, if we wanted to update the get slash, which gets all the users, it would just be users. Well, actually, let's just replace this. It would just be users.find. And in here, you put your same where clause if you want. In this case, I'm not going to put a where clause because we're not dealing with it. We're just finding all of them. Same exact thing. Instead of toArray, though, we don't need the toArray. This just becomes a callback. Why don't we need toArray? Well, because Mongoose kind of assumes that you wanted it as an array. They're completely comfortable with that. So you just don't need that toArray. That also kind of differs between MongoDB and Mongoose, how they handle things like count and aggregation, whereas in the find, you would actually be handling those before you called toArray, whereas in Mongoose, they handle them in the query. So here's our find. Restart that again. Go here. We'll call get all users, send, and there we go. There's all of our users. So what have we gone over today? How to connect to Mongoose. Pretty much the same as you do it in MongoDB. It's actually a little bit more convenient though, because instead of that callback stuff, we just have this connection. in the server, you have that DB once. So there is kind of a callback thing, but it's more of an event handle, which is a little bit cleaner. And once that's ready, you can listen to it. Then inside we create our models, which use schema. We use regular types for it. And then we create the model from that schema, export the model. Remember, MongoDB doesn't actually create collections or anything until you actually utilize them, and that's why there's no asynchronicity or like how SQLize has to sync. Mongoose doesn't have to do that. Then when we actually go into our APIs, to insert, we call create, and it's pretty much the same exact thing as the Mongo. We have our first parameter being the actual data, second one being the callback, and if you try to put fields in here that are not in the schema, they just get ignored. findOne and find. findOne is exactly the same as in MongoDB, your where clause, and then your callback. Find has the where clause like MongoDB, but it does not have the toArray call. It doesn't need that. So it's a little bit more convenient. So this is a good start into creation and reading in Mongoose. In later videos, we're going to talk about more advanced topics. Hope this is helpful, and I'll see you all in class.